Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're diving into one of the most shocking collapses in world history. The fall of the Incan Empire wasn't the result of a massive war or drawn-out siege, it unraveled in a matter of months, toppled by fewer than 200 Spanish invaders. But how could such a powerful civilization crumble so quickly? Well, before we get to the conquest, we have to understand the systems on both sides. Because what we're really looking at here is a collision of two completely different worlds. On one side, we have the Incan Empire under Atahualpa. Picture a civilization where the emperor, called the Sapa Inca, wasn't just a political ruler, he was considered divine, the son of the sun god Inti. He owned all the land, commanded the labor of millions, and controlled the flow of food, goods, and even marriage across the empire. Power wasn't shared, it was concentrated. Political, religious, and economic authority all wrapped up in one man at the top of a highly centralized hierarchy. Now zoom over to Europe. The Spanish crown, under Charles V, wasn't just playing king. He was the head of a rapidly expanding empire fueled by mercantilism and religious mission. Gold, glory, and God, those were the driving forces. Spain wasn't just trading for influence, it was spreading Catholicism by the sword and chasing resources to fill royal treasuries. Conquest wasn't a byproduct, it was the plan. And here's where it gets fascinating. The Spanish and the Incas didn't just differ in their languages or weapons, they had completely opposite ideas of what power looked like. For the Incas, stability came from hierarchy and divine order. The Spanish, on the other hand, valorized conquest, individual ambition, and religious conversion. You can already feel the tension brewing. One side leaned into rigid structure, the other thrived on disruption and initiative. So when these two systems finally met, it wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a clash of worldviews. Before the Spanish ever fired a shot, the Inca Empire was already bleeding from the inside. You see, when Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Andes, he didn't encounter a unified civilization standing strong. He walked into the smoldering aftermath of a brutal civil war, a war not between foreigners and natives, but between brothers. Atahualpa and Huáscar, both sons of the previous emperor, had plunged the empire into chaos as they battled for the throne. And this wasn't just a sibling rivalry. It was a full-scale, empire-wide conflict that drained military strength, divided loyalties, and left the once mighty Incan state fractured at its core. Atahualpa eventually emerged victorious, but it was a victory bought at an enormous cost. Cities burned, armies shattered, regional loyalties tested, and most importantly, trust in the imperial system had been deeply shaken. This leads us to what historians call a legitimacy crisis. Atahualpa had won the throne, yes, but his authority was contested, his claim fresh, and his support uneven. The civil war had loosened the tight grip of central control. Factions were still simmering, rivals were still alive, and no one knew who truly spoke for the empire anymore. Now imagine being Francisco Pizarro, arriving with only a few hundred men, but armed with steel, horses, and the full confidence of a conquering civilization. He didn't just march in. He observed. He waited. He timed his entrance like a predator sensing a wounded prey. And when he did make his move, it wasn't with brute force. It was with strategic manipulation. Divide and conquer wasn't just a tactic, it was the entire plan. Pizarro understood something vital. You don't have to break an empire if it's already broken. The Spanish didn't create instability, they arrived as it peaked. And in the political fog that followed fratricide and succession battles, they seized an opportunity so precise, it would change the fate of an entire continent. Now, let's talk about Cajamarca. This was not your typical battlefield. There were no legions lining up across a plain, no siege engines crashing against stone walls. In fact, there wasn't even a real fight. What happened at Cajamarca was something far more chilling, a complete collapse of imperial power in a single afternoon. Francisco Pizarro had no interest in charging headfirst into open conflict. He didn't have the numbers. What he had was a plan. He lured Atahualpa to Cajamarca's plaza under the guise of diplomacy. A meeting between kings. A chance to talk, to negotiate. But hidden in that plaza were Spanish troops, cavalry, cannons, and steel weapons, all waiting. And when the moment came, the ambush was swift, brutal, and surgical. In a matter of minutes, the Inca Emperor was captured. Just like that, the most powerful man in South America was in chains. But let's dig deeper. This wasn't just about clever tactics. The Spanish had a level of military technology the Incas had never seen. Horses? They might as well have been monsters. Steel swords? Deadly and unfamiliar. Firearms? Thunderous, terrifying, and psychologically devastating. The Incas didn't just lose a battle, they lost their ability to understand the rules of the fight. And the Spanish didn't stop at weapons. They used religious symbolism to confuse and intimidate. They handed Atahualpa a Bible, and when he discarded it, unfamiliar with its meaning, it was taken as justification for violence. Cultural misunderstandings were twisted into moral cover. Religious superiority masked a cold strategy of domination. So here's the shocking truth. No massive army marched through the Andes. No prolonged war wore down the Inca state. Cajamarca was a bloodless coup wrapped in the guise of diplomacy. And in that moment, the empire began to unravel. So how did such a small Spanish force manage to dismantle an empire of millions? The answer lies in the systems behind the swords. Pizarro wasn't operating from a detailed instruction manual handed down by the king. He was making decisions in real time, based on local information, gut instinct, and opportunity. His authority was loosely granted, his methods improvised. In short, he had autonomy, and that autonomy meant flexibility. He could pivot, adapt, exploit weaknesses, and move fast. He didn't need to wait for orders. He was the order. Now compare that with the Incan command structure. When Atahualpa was captured, something eerie happened. The whole empire paused. Subordinates, generals, administrators, they all froze. You see, the Incan state was built on the absolute authority of one man. The Sapa Inca was not just a ruler, he was the axis around which the entire machine turned. Without him, nothing moved. No orders, no counterattacks, no shift in strategy. Atahualpa's absence wasn't just a shock, it created total paralysis. And here's the tragic irony. What made the Incan system strong, its centralization, its order, its efficiency, also made it incredibly fragile. Once the center was compromised, the rest had no protocols for independent action, no backup systems, no local initiative. The empire was designed to function from the top down, and when the top fell, so did everything else. It's a classic case of structure shaping outcome. The Spanish relied on decentralized initiative, the Incas relied on centralized command, and when those two models collided, one adapted, the other shattered. Let's talk about the ransom, because this part of the story isn't just dramatic, it's revealing. After capturing Atahualpa, the Spanish didn't immediately execute him. No, they saw something else, something glittering. The emperor offered to fill an entire room with gold and 2 more with silver, in exchange for his release. Imagine that. Walls and walls of precious metal, floor to ceiling, collected from across the empire. But here's the twist. This wasn't just greed. It was economics. To the Spanish, gold meant power. It meant influence at court, promotions, titles, land, and freedom from debt. These weren't salaried soldiers, they were independent contractors in armor. Their loyalty wasn't to a government paycheck, it was to opportunity. This is what historians call incentive-driven conquest. Each conquistador had a stake in the outcome. Each one had something personal to gain. And when Atahualpa promised them a treasure beyond imagination, they didn't just see a prisoner, they saw profit. Now from the Incan side, something different was happening. The empire was built on centralized wealth. Gold wasn't just currency, it was sacred. It adorned temples, honored the gods, and represented cosmic order. So when Atahualpa demanded tribute from across the land to meet the ransom, the system responded. Local officials and laborers obeyed. Caravans moved. Temples were stripped. It was a logistical marvel, but also a vulnerability. The same centralized system that made wealth easily mobilized also made it visible and exploitable. To the Spanish, this was a jackpot. A single point of leverage, a giant vault disguised as a civilization. And once that gold started flowing, it sealed Atahualpa's fate. Because here's the cruel calculus, if he had that much to give, what might be hidden elsewhere? Why release the source of your treasure when you could just keep digging? So the ransom wasn't just a transaction. It was a window into 2 worldviews, one spiritual, one economic. And it revealed, perhaps more than any battle, why this conquest happened so fast. By now, the question has become unavoidable. How could such a vast empire fall apart so quickly? The answer lies not in swords or horses, but in systems. On the surface, the Inca Empire seemed unshakable. Millions of subjects, a vast road network, sophisticated agriculture, grand cities carved into the Andes. But underneath all that grandeur was a dangerous rigidity. Everything in the Incan world flowed through the state. Food was redistributed from central storehouses. Labor was assigned through top-down mandates. Land was owned by the government, not by individuals or local communities. And every region, no matter how distant, was expected to obey orders from the imperial core. This kind of control can look efficient until something breaks. And when Atahualpa was captured, the signal from the top went dark. There was no plan B, no flexibility at the local level, no culture of initiative. It was like cutting the power to a giant machine with no manual restart. Now contrast that with the Spanish. Their system was messy, even chaotic, but it allowed for adaptation. Power wasn't locked in place, it was distributed. It flowed through ambition, negotiation, and competition. In a way, it was anti-fragile. The more chaotic things became, the more the conquistadors thrived. This is what the collapse reveals. Centralized systems may look strong, but they're often brittle. Once the linchpin goes, the whole thing can crumble in days. And for the Incas, that's exactly what happened. The empire didn't lose a war, it failed a stress test, and in the vacuum that followed, there was nothing, no doctrine, no leadership pipeline, no counterforce, to fill the void. So the Spanish didn't just conquer an empire, they exposed its underlying flaw, a civilization designed for command, but not for crisis. At this point, we have to stop and ask, what do we actually make of this? Was this conquest inevitable? Was it fate, or was it fraud cloaked in armor and scripture? The Spanish called it a civilizing mission, a divine appointment, a righteous war against paganism. But history tells a more complicated story. This was not justice, it was opportunism, and it raises questions we still wrestle with today. Can any empire claim moral superiority while trading in violence and deception? And what about the Incas? They too had conquered others, expanded by force, absorbed cultures and reshaped identities. Does that make what happened to them less tragic, or just part of a brutal historical cycle? Here's the uncomfortable truth. History is full of collapses that look like moral tales in hindsight. A centralized empire, weakened from within, meets a cunning outsider who rewrites the future. It's happened again and again. Rome, Byzantium, the Qing, systems that seemed eternal until they weren't. And what's haunting about Cajamarca is how fast it all happened. One meeting, one ambush, one vanished emperor. But beneath that speed was something slow and deep, a system that had lost the ability to adapt, a people bound to a ruler they could not replace, and a world where knowledge, initiative, and trust were hoarded at the top. These are not just stories about the past. They are warnings about what happens when power becomes too centralized, when loyalty replaces flexibility, when complexity is mistaken for strength. So the fall of the Incan Empire isn't just a tale of conquest. It's a mirror, and what we see in it depends on whether we're willing to ask the hard questions. So what are we left with? The story of Cajamarca isn't just about a battle. It's about the deep architecture of civilizations, what holds them up, and what makes them fall. The Inca Empire was vast, advanced, and deeply spiritual, but it was also brittle. Its strength was its centralization, and its downfall was that same centralization. It could command loyalty across mountains, but not resilience under pressure. The Spanish weren't necessarily better, they were just different. Decentralized, ambitious, unpredictable. Each man had his own motive. There was no grand imperial strategy, only the raw drive of individuals acting in real time. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson here. When systems concentrate power in one place, when they leave no room for initiative, no margin for adaptation, they become vulnerable to disruption, even by a handful of outsiders. It's not just about what a society builds. It's about how it responds to the unexpected, to stress, to failure, to change. And in that way, Cajamarca still speaks to us, because every empire, every nation, every system carries the seeds of its own undoing, or its own renewal. Thank you for watching Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more stories that dig deeper, ask bigger questions, and bring history to life, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to listen on the go, check out the podcast version. There's a link waiting in the description. We've got many more episodes coming, because the past never stays buried. Not really.